In the remote mountains of Northern California, where redwood trees grow so tall they pierce the clouds, and their roots run so deep they touch the bones of the earth, there exists a place that locals stopped mentioning after 1889. The Cathedral Grove, as it was known to the indigenous Yurok people, was a forest within a forest. A stand of ancient redwoods where trees measured 40 feet across at their base and reached heights that made men feel like insects crawling at the feet of gods. The morning light rarely reached the forest floor here, filtered through hundreds of feet of branches and needles until it became something closer to twilight, even at midday. The air was thick with moisture. Sound behaved strangely, echoing in ways that made it impossible to determine direction or distance, and the smell was unlike any other forest, rich with decay but also something else, something ancient and organic that made men's skin prickle with instinctive unease even before anything went wrong. In March of 1889, the Mackenzie Timber Company, based out of Eureka, secured rights to harvest timber from a section of coastal forest that included the Cathedral Grove. They assembled a crew of 32 experienced loggers, men who had spent years felling trees across Oregon and Northern California. These weren't greenhorns or city boys playing at frontier work. These were seasoned professionals who knew the dangers of old-growth logging and respected the power of trees that had stood for 1,000 years or more. The crew was led by a Norwegian immigrant named Erik Thorsen, a man of 42 years who had been logging since he was 14. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hands scarred from decades of rope burns and saw work, Erik commanded respect through competence rather than bluster. He was known for running safe camps, for bringing his men home alive at the end of every season. His second-in-command was a Scotsman named Duncan MacLeod, 38 years old. A man who could calculate board feet in his head faster than most men could write the numbers, and who could read weather and the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. The rest of the crew was a mixture of Scandinavians, Irish, Germans, and a handful of Americans, ranging in age from 20 to 55. Among them was James Fletcher, a quiet man from Vermont, who kept a detailed journal that would later become the primary source for understanding what happened in those woods. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. The crew arrived at the logging site on March 12, 1889, hauling their equipment on wagons drawn by teams of oxen. They established their base camp at the edge of Cathedral Grove, in a clearing where previous loggers had worked decades earlier. The remnants of old logging operations were still visible, rusted saw blades half buried in moss, stumps so large they served as platforms for setting up tents. Erik insisted on proper camp procedures, designated areas for cooking, sleeping, and equipment storage, fire breaks cleared around the perimeter, and strict rules about maintaining tools and safety protocols. The first week passed without incident as the men began the slow process of felling the enormous redwoods. These trees couldn't be taken down quickly or carelessly. A single redwood might contain enough lumber to build 5 houses, but a mistake in cutting could crush men, destroy equipment, or send tons of wood crashing through the forest in unpredictable directions. The loggers worked in teams, 2 men to a tree, using long cross-cut saws that required perfect rhythm and coordination. The work was exhausting, muscles screaming after hours of sawing through wood harder than iron, sweat mixing with sawdust until men looked like they'd been dipped in rust-colored powder. But it was honest work, and the pay was good, better than most jobs available to working men in 1889. James Fletcher's journal from this first week describes routine camp life. He mentions the quality of the evening meals prepared by the camp cook, a Chinese immigrant named Lin, who could make salt pork and beans taste almost civilized. He describes card games by lamplight, men trading stories about logging operations in other forests, the usual complaints about aching backs and mosquitoes. But Fletcher also notes something that others apparently dismissed as unimportant. The wildlife behaved strangely around Cathedral Grove. Birds would fly directly toward the ancient trees, but then veer away at the last moment, refusing to land in the branches. Deer that were common throughout the surrounding forest were never seen within the grove itself. Even the oxen, normally placid animals that would graze contentedly anywhere grass grew, became nervous when brought too close to the oldest trees, pulling against their tethers and rolling their eyes until the whites showed. During the second week, the crew began working deeper into Cathedral Grove, moving beyond the perimeter trees, into the heart of the ancient stand. The light grew dimmer here, the silence more profound. The loggers noticed that their voices didn't carry properly. Words seemed to be absorbed by the massive trunks surrounding them, creating a feeling of isolation even when men stood only yards apart. Eric Thorson found this troubling enough to implement a new safety protocol. Each team would check in with the camp every 2 hours by sending a runner back with a status report. No one worked more than a quarter mile from base camp without explicit permission. It was during this second week that men began reporting odd sensations while working among the oldest trees. A feeling of being watched, though no one could ever spot an observer. Moments of disorientation where a logger would lose track of time, thinking only minutes had passed when his partner insisted it had been over an hour. Duncan MacLeod, the practical Scotsman who had no patience for superstition, admitted in conversation with Eric that he sometimes heard what sounded like breathing in the spaces between saw strokes, a slow, deep rhythm that seemed to come from the earth itself. The third week brought the first serious incident. 2 loggers, brothers named Carl and Hans Dietrich, failed to check in at their appointed time. Eric sent Duncan with a search party to their last known location, a massive redwood they'd been working on for 3 days. They found the tree, the saw still embedded in the cut, and a significant amount of blood on the ground and splattered across the bark. But they found no bodies, no trail leading away from the site, and no explanation for where 2 grown men could have gone. The blood was tested later and confirmed to be human. Tools were scattered in a pattern that suggested sudden panic, but the men themselves had simply vanished. Eric wanted to call off the operation immediately and report the disappearance to authorities in Eureka, but Mackenzie Timber Company had invested significant money in this contract. And the camp boss, a man named Silas Blackwood who represented company interests, insisted they continue working while conducting searches during off hours. Silas was a Boston-educated man who viewed the frontier as a place to be conquered and exploited, not feared. He dismissed the disappearance as likely the result of a bear attack, though he couldn't explain the lack of bodies or drag marks. The crews became nervous, but most needed the money badly enough to keep working. Over the next week, other men began to vanish. First, it was singles. A Norwegian named Ole Henriksen disappeared while walking to the Latran during the night. Then, a German logger named Friedrich Schultz failed to return from a solo scouting trip to mark the next day's trees. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. The man would be there one moment, and simply gone the next, with no sign of struggle, no tracks leading away, nothing to suggest where they might have gone. By the end of the 4th week, 7 men had disappeared from the original crew of 32. Those who remained were showing signs of severe stress. Men who had worked dangerous jobs for decades without complaint now jumped at shadows and refused to work alone even during daylight hours. Ames Fletcher's journal entries from this period become increasingly fragmented and disturbing, his normally neat handwriting deteriorating into barely legible scrawls that suggested a hand that trembled constantly. He describes nights where sleep was impossible, where the darkness between the trees seemed to move with purpose and intent, where shapes that were almost human but not quite would stand just at the edge of the firelight, watching with eyes that reflected no light but somehow conveyed malevolent intelligence. He mentions that several men had begun hearing voices calling their names from deep within the grove. Voices that sounded like family members or friends, mothers calling the sons who were thousands of miles away, wives summoning husbands who had left them years before, children crying for fathers with perfect vocal mimicry that made grown men weep with longing to respond. But when investigated, these voices revealed nothing but empty forest, silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure, and trees that seemed to lean closer when backs were turned. creating passages that hadn't existed moments before and closing off routes that should have been clear. The oxen, normally stolid animals that would work through almost any conditions, began refusing to approach certain areas of the grove, pulling against their tethers with such force that they injured themselves, their eyes rolling white with terror that no amount of coaxing could overcome. One ox was found dead in its traces one morning, no visible cause. Its body already stiff, though men swore it had been alive and healthy just hours before, its expression frozen in what looked like absolute terror. Mouth open as if it had died mid-scream, though oxen don't make sounds like that, and this one certainly hadn't been heard during the night. 3 loggers who went to investigate these voices together reported experiencing simultaneous hallucinations, where they saw a massive structure between the trees. Something like a building, but made of living wood, with doorways that led into spaces that couldn't physically exist within the trunks. When they backed away and looked again, there was nothing there but ordinary trees. Duncan MacLeod, always the skeptic, suggested that the men were suffering from exhaustion and possibly contaminated water. He organized a systematic search of the entire area, looking for underground caves or hidden ravines where the missing men might have fallen. They found nothing. The forest floor was remarkably stable. No sinkholes, no hidden hazards that could account for 7 grown men vanishing without a trace. It was during the 5th week that the situation deteriorated completely. Men began refusing to work, clustering together in groups, and refusing to venture more than a few yards from the base camp. Silas Blackwood threatened to fire anyone who didn't return to duty, but his authority had evaporated in the face of mounting terror. Eric Thorson, who had initially tried to maintain order and complete the contract, finally admitted that something was fundamentally wrong with Cathedral Grove. He made the decision to evacuate, to pack up the equipment, and return to Eureka to report what had happened. But leaving proved more difficult than anyone anticipated. On the morning they were supposed to depart, the camp cook Lynn was found dead in his tent, his body positioned as if sleeping peacefully, but with his eyes open and fixed on something above him. The camp doctor, a former Army surgeon named Thomas Barrett, examined the body and found no cause of death, no marks, no signs of violence or poisoning. Lynn's heart had simply stopped, his face frozen in an expression that Dr. Barrett described in his report as profound terror, mixed with something else, something almost like recognition. 2 more men died the same way over the next 2 days, found dead in their bedrolls with no apparent cause, their eyes wide open and staring at nothing. The remaining crew, now reduced to 22 men, became desperate to leave. But when they attempted to pack the wagons and prepare for departure, they discovered that their oxen had vanished during the night. All 12 animals gone without a sound despite being hobbled and tethered. The possibility of walking out was discussed, but they were over 40 miles from the nearest settlement, through difficult terrain, carrying tools and supplies that couldn't simply be abandoned without bankrupting the men who owned them. Eric made the decision that half the crew would make the journey on foot to Eureka to bring help and additional transportation, while the other half would remain at camp to guard the equipment. Duncan MacLeod volunteered to lead the evacuation party, taking 10 men with him. They left at dawn on a clear morning in late April, well supplied with food and water, armed with rifles in case of trouble. They never reached Eureka, and no trace of them or their route was ever found. The men left behind waited for 3 weeks, watching their supplies dwindle and their sanity fray. James Fletcher's journal from this period is barely coherent, filled with fragmentary observations and drawings that suggest a mind unraveling. He describes the trees moving when no one was looking directly at them, rearranging themselves to create new patterns, new pathways through the forest. He mentions voices that spoke in languages he'd never heard, words that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and manifest directly in his thoughts. 5 more men disappeared during this period, including Silas Blackwood, who had remained grimly insistent that everything could be explained rationally, even as the evidence of something deeply wrong accumulated around them. On the night he vanished, Fletcher recorded that Silas had walked into the forest alone, drawn by what he claimed was the sound of Duncan MacLeod calling for help. Despite multiple men warning him not to go, Silas walked calmly into the darkness between the trees and simply didn't return. By early June, only 6 men remained from the original 32. Eric Thorson, Dr. Thomas Barrett, James Fletcher, and 3 others whose names were recorded as Michael O'Brien, Lars Johansson, and a young logger known only as Kentucky Jim, whose real name was apparently never documented. These 6 men, pushed beyond the limits of sanity by weeks of isolation and mounting horror, made a final decision to attempt walking out regardless of the distance or difficulty. They abandoned all equipment except what they could carry, taking only weapons, minimal supplies, and Fletcher's journal, which Eric insisted must be preserved as a record of what had happened. They left base camp on June 3, 1889, and began walking south, using the sun to maintain direction. But the forest didn't want to let them go. For 3 days they walked, covering what should have been 15 miles, only to somehow circle back to their own camp. Landmarks they'd passed reappeared in impossible locations. Trails they'd cut through underbrush seemed to lead them in loops. Time behaved strangely. Hours passing in what felt like minutes, then minutes stretching into seeming hours. Dr. Barrett, trained in rationality and scientific thinking, attempted to maintain a logical explanation for their predicament, suggesting they were simply disoriented and walking in natural circles as lost people often did. But even he couldn't explain how they consistently ended up back at the same camp, despite making efforts to mark their trail and maintain straight-line travel using the sun's position. On the 4th day of their escape attempt, Kentucky Jim simply stopped walking. When asked what was wrong, he calmly explained that he could see now, that it was all clear, that they'd been invited and refusing the invitation was the real mistake. He then turned and walked directly into Cathedral Grove, moving toward the largest tree any of them had seen, a redwood so massive it seemed less like a living thing and more like a natural cathedral carved from wood. They never saw him again. The remaining 5 continued their attempts to escape, growing more desperate as days passed. Lars Johansson was the next to vanish, disappearing while the group slept, leaving no tracks, no sign of struggle. Then Michael O'Brien walked away from the group in broad daylight, announcing calmly that he'd been called and it would be rude not to answer. When Eric tried to physically restrain him, O'Brien displayed strength that should have been impossible for a man of his size, throwing the bigger Norwegian to the ground and walking purposefully into the trees. That left Eric Thorson, Dr. Thomas Barrett, and James Fletcher, 3 men from an original 32, lost in a forest that seemed determined to keep them. Fletcher's journal from this period is the most disturbing document to survive the ordeal. His final coherent entry, dated June 19, 1889, describes a night where the 3 remaining survivors huddled together for warmth and security, watching as the forest around them seemed to come alive with movement in the darkness. Shapes that were almost human but not quite, figures that stood between the trees and watched with eyes that reflected no light. Fletcher wrote that they could hear singing, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Voices in harmonies that predated human music, that spoke of times when these trees were young and the world was very different. On the morning of June 20th, Dr. Thomas Barrett was found by the other 2 men sitting against the base of a redwood, his medical bag open beside him, his hands folded peacefully in his lap. He was dead. No apparent cause, no visible trauma. His expression was serene, almost beatific, as if he'd discovered something wonderful in his final moments. His eyes were open, fixed on something high up in the branches above, something that Eric and Fletcher saw no trace of when they looked up themselves. Eric Thorson and James Fletcher, the last 2 survivors, made a final desperate attempt to escape. They abandoned everything except the journal, a single rifle and the clothes on their backs. For 6 days they walked, barely sleeping, eating whatever they could forage, driving themselves beyond exhaustion in their determination to reach civilization. Fletcher's journal entries from this period are increasingly incoherent, mixing observations of the physical forest with descriptions of visions or hallucinations. It's impossible to tell which. He describes trees that breathed, ground that pulsed like a living heartbeat, voices that spoke in tongues he'd never heard but somehow understood. On June 26, 1889, two men stumbled out of the forest near a small mining settlement called Willow Creek, about 60 miles south of where Cathedral Grove should have been. They were emaciated, filthy, their clothes in rags, their eyes holding a look that the miners who found them described as both ancient and hollow. One was identified as Eric Thorson, though he'd aged decades in the 3 months since entering the forest. His hair gone completely white, his face carved with lines that suggested experiences beyond normal human endurance. The other was James Fletcher, still clutching his journal, though he seemed unable or unwilling to speak in any language the miners recognized. The two men were taken to Eureka, where authorities and company representatives attempted to understand what had happened to the logging crew. Eric Thorson could provide only fragmentary information. He remembered entering the forest, remembered men disappearing, remembered walking for what felt like years through trees that moved and changed when no one watched them directly. But his account was inconsistent, jumping between events without clear chronology, mixing what seemed like factual description with what could only be delusion or madness. James Fletcher never spoke coherent English again. He would sometimes utter phrases in what linguists from the University of California later identified as no known human language. Structures and sounds that didn't correspond to any recorded linguistic family. He would draw pictures in the dirt or on paper when given the means, images of the forest, of structures hidden within the trees, of figures that were neither human nor animal, but something else entirely. A year after emerging from the forest, Eric Thorson died in his sleep in a boarding house in San Francisco. The landlady found him in bed, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling, his expression peaceful. The coroner could find no cause of death. His heart had simply stopped, much like the loggers who had died in their tents months earlier. James Fletcher lived longer, confined to a state hospital for the mentally ill, where doctors studied his condition with a mixture of fascination and horror. He would sometimes experience episodes where he seemed perfectly lucid, speaking clearly about his time before entering Cathedral Grove, discussing his family back in Vermont, his reasons for coming west. But these moments never lasted more than a few minutes before he would slip back into speaking the unknown tongue, his eyes focusing on things that no one else could see. He died in 1923, at the age of 64, found sitting in the hospital courtyard, looking north toward the distant mountains where Cathedral Grove still stood. Fletcher's journal, recovered when he emerged from the forest, provides the most detailed account of what the loggers experienced, though many pages are illegible, damaged by water and blood. The entries become increasingly strange as time progressed, mixing practical observations about logging work with disturbing descriptions of phenomena that couldn't possibly be real. In one entry, Fletcher describes watching a logger named Hans walk directly into a tree trunk, not around it but through it, as if the solid wood were only an illusion masking a doorway to somewhere else. In another, he claims that the crew found ancient carvings on some of the oldest trees, symbols that predated any known human presence in the region, marks that seemed to shift and change when observed from different angles. The Mackenzie Timber Company quietly abandoned their contract to harvest timber from Cathedral Grove. They reported the incident as a logging accident involving fire, claiming that most of the crew had perished when their camp burned and the survivors had gotten lost trying to escape the blaze. This explanation satisfied legal requirements and prevented difficult questions about what had actually happened. The company dissolved 3 years later, the owner having suffered what was described as a complete nervous breakdown after visiting the site to recover equipment and bodies. He claimed to have spent only 2 hours at the abandoned camp, but emerged 3 days later, unable or unwilling to explain where the time had gone. No bodies were ever recovered from Cathedral Grove. The few pieces of equipment left behind were found by a subsequent expedition, but they appeared to have been there for decades rather than months, corroded and overgrown with moss, in ways that suggested far more time had passed than was possible. The local Yurok people, when asked about the Cathedral Grove, would only say that it was a place where the world was thinner where things from before the time of humans still lingered. They had never entered that particular section of forest, maintaining it as sacred ground where humans weren't welcome, where the old things still held power. The official report filed by Humboldt County authorities lists the incident as an accident due to difficult working conditions and inadequate safety protocols, noting that 28 men died or went missing and 4 survived, though 2 of the survivors subsequently died under mysterious circumstances. The report makes no mention of the strange circumstances surrounding the disappearances, no mention of the inexplicable deaths, no mention of Fletcher's journal or the linguistic anomalies in the survivors' speech. To this day, the Cathedral Grove section of California's redwood forests remains largely untouched by logging operations. Modern timber companies, when asked, cite a difficult terrain and low-quality wood as reasons for avoiding the area, though analysis suggests the timber there is actually superior to surrounding forests. Hikers occasionally venture into the grove, and some report feeling unwelcome, experiencing vertigo or disorientation, hearing sounds that don't quite match normal forest activity. A few have reported finding things in the forest that shouldn't be there, structures made of living wood that can't be explained by natural growth patterns, carvings in languages no one can read, and clearings where compasses spin uselessly, unable to find magnetic north. The fate of the 28 men who never returned from Cathedral Grove remains unknown. Whether they died in those ancient woods or whether something else happened to them, something stranger and more terrible than death, is a question that can't be answered with certainty. What is documented is this: 32 men entered those woods in March of 1889. Experienced loggers who knew their trade and trusted their tools. Only 4 emerged, their minds shattered, speaking in tongues no scholar could identify, their eyes holding knowledge that drove 2 of them to early graves and condemned the others to lives of haunted madness. Sometimes, park rangers working the Northern California forests report finding evidence of old camps in the deep woods, sites that appear decades or centuries old, but contain equipment and artifacts that date to the 1880s, as if the places where the loggers worked exist in some temporal pocket separate from normal time. These discoveries are quietly documented and then avoided, marked as hazardous areas on maps available only to Forestry Service personnel. The Cathedral Grove still stands, its ancient redwoods towering into the fog, their roots drinking deep from earth that has seen civilizations rise and fall, their branches reaching toward a sky they've watched for millennia. The Yurok people still avoid that section of forest, still maintain that it's not a place for humans, that the old things dwelling there in the twilight beneath those ancient trees aren't meant to be disturbed, aren't meant to be witnessed by eyes too young and too brief to comprehend what they're seeing. Whether the loggers died there, or whether they found something else, something worse than death, whether they crossed some threshold between the world we know and some other place hidden in the shadows beneath trees, older than human memory, these are questions that official records will never answer. What remains is the story, passed down through generations of foresters and loggers, a cautionary tale about places that shouldn't be disturbed, about forests that remember times before humans walked the earth, about trees that have witnessed things we can't imagine and won't tolerate those who intrude with saws and axes, and the arrogance to think that anything truly old can be reduced to lumber and profit. If this story revealed something you never knew about the dangers hidden in America's ancient forests, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most. And if you want more untold stories of expeditions that went terribly wrong, subscribe. These stories matter, not just as history, but as reminders that the world is older and stranger than we like to believe, and that some places have never truly been tamed, never truly been understood, and perhaps never should be. The 32 loggers who entered Cathedral Grove in 1889 learned that lesson, though only 4 lived to tell any part of it, and only James Fletcher's journal survived to provide even a glimpse of what they experienced in those ancient woods. What happened there remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in California history, A story that official records tried to bury, but that continues to echo through the redwood forests. Carried on fog that never quite dissipates, and whispered in wind that moves through branches hundreds of feet above the forest floor. Some say that if you enter the cathedral grove on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the fog is thick, you can still hear voices singing in languages that predate humanity. Still see shapes moving between trees that are older than civilization. Still feel the presence of something that dwells there in the twilight. Something that the loggers disturbed and that perhaps still waits, patient and eternal as the ancient redwoods themselves, for the next humans who dare to enter with axes and the intention to cut down trees that have stood since before their ancestors learned to walk upright.